The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 came on the heels of a lot of changes in the 1930s. So the Progressive Era really laid the groundwork for this kind of social reform and political reform. The Indian Reorganization Act was intended to reverse some of the really harmful effects of the Dawes Act by ending allotment as a practice and by returning some of the land that had been unrightfully, unjustly taken away because of that parceling process. The other seemingly positive change that the Indian Reorganization Act implemented was the so-called return to self-government on a tribal basis. What that meant was that tribes were told that they needed to form a tribal council, adopt a constitution, and basically develop a governance structure that is modeled on the federal government structure. So while they were saying we're turning over government into your hands, it was a model that was not from the traditions of governance within the tribal nation itself. And it was still a model of government that ultimately had to answer to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So one of the things we see with Indian reorganization is that there's a very narrow idea of what constitutes self-government. And we also see a real mixed bag in some of the reforms. There are definitely some pros in terms of ending allotment, for example, and recognizing that self-government is valid, but the cons are in what that would actually look like and how that would play out in lived reality. So kind of getting ahead of myself with the slides here, but the other thing that is a pro is ending abusive boarding school practices. One of the things we could see is that historically, prior to a lot of the reforms that Collier implemented, there was a lot of overt abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse in boarding schools, and that this was a systemic practice in many cases. And the Indian Reorganization Act recognized the problematic nature of this. A lot of so-called muckraker journalists were exposing the terrible conditions in a lot of these schools, and there was quite a bit of pressure to have more humane schooling experiences for American Indians. However, putting new policies in place for the boarding schools didn't necessarily mean that the abuse itself ended or that the fundamental goal of these institutions changed. So a lot of other problems still continued, such as a lack of community control over the schooling of their children, big gaps in funding, and really problematic curriculum that was intended to assimilate students and teach them not to adhere to the culture or ways of knowing from their community. So in terms of ending allotment, also, while some of the land was returned, most of it was not, and the damage was already done. The other thing is the method of including culture in schools during this time was not really based on indigenous ways of knowing or of approaching content knowledge in a way that would be deemed appropriate within that tribal nation. Instead, it was more like a factual content coverage. So some of the difference would be, if you're going to approach some of these cultural ideas, but you're going to do it with a worksheet perspective, that really undermines the whole purpose of including that idea in the first place. And then, one of the other cons is that idea of setting up schooling and strengthening it still often had an industrial or vocational education focus. And so from that standpoint, setting people up to have the kind of education that would lead to self-determination in a really good way wasn't quite there. So Collier and the Indian Reorganization Act, or IRA, definitely affirmed this idea of tribal culture or self-government, but not necessarily sovereignty in the sense that sovereignty means being able to decide to opt out of some of these assimilating processes, or the ability to just be left alone. Some of the constraints also were because of the differences in interests and purposes between the federal and tribal governments. And there's a lot of patronizing sentiment embedded in these policies, especially in terms of um, portraying tribal nations as kind of students under the leadership of the federal government, or as people who are not fit to lead their own lives, or as people who are dependent rather than adult and fit to make their own decisions.